The Pick Six Podcast. I'm Sam McKewon along with Evan Bland. I'm outside on my porch. It's very nice out. Evan is down at the Memorial Stadium where apparently it's still winter because they're not playing a football game. What day is that from, Evan, that picture?
I don't know. I think it's from a January or February when there was snow on the ground and people thought it was a cool image, but unfortunately it's kind of a metaphor right now for the state of affairs with fall sports.
Well, maybe they'll be playing in that weather here in a couple of months. We're going to talk a lot about the Big Ten decision that has been made. The Big Ten kind of closed the door officially this week, and then I talked to Nebraska Athletic Bill Moose about just some interesting conversations. I'm having a little bit of internet issues, so if I have to move inside, I will, but I think I'll be okay. But there's some interesting decisions to unpack and go through. A lot of why the process went wrong and how it may be different moving forward, because I think it really might be different moving forward. I guess we'll find out. But we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll have sort of an eligibility potpourri following that, and we'll talk a little baseball at the end because Evan's done a couple of stories. Talked to Coach Will Bolt about remaking the roster. They significantly remade it. It's very different than it was, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that. We want to remind everybody that our sponsor is the Schwalbach Agency. Team Schwalbach is a family-owned all-state insurance agency with 4 licensed insurance pros, saving thousands of Nebraska Husker fans money. They sell homeowner, auto, life, and flood insurance across Nebraska, and they also insure all the big boy toys, motorcycles, boats, RVs, off-road vehicles. If you've had a roof replaced in the last 5 years, give Daryl Schwalbach, Kyle Schwalbach, Nancy Mostek, or Kyle Murdoch a call at 402-590-5200. They can help you save a bundle. Free no obligation insurance reviews and quotes. They're going to make sure that all of their fellow Nebraska fans are properly protected. You can reach them at 402-590-5200 or www.nebraskaallstate.com. That's www.nebraskaallstate.com. Team Schwalbach, thank you for their sponsorship. Okay, so the Big Ten kind of closed the door this week on revisiting a fall football season. Kevin Warren finally came out with a letter on Wednesday, a week after, or I guess 8 days after the league had made the decision to postpone fall sports, more further explaining the decision to postpone it. I'm not sure that the letter did a whole hell of a lot to quell any concerns or outrage or frustration. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about partially why so many schools within the league were frustrated with the way that this came out. But since we last had a podcast, so we last talked on Friday, since that podcast, it has been a very interesting time. Most of what we talked about last week was about how Nebraska was beat up by the media, that Nebraska didn't have a lot of allies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was a fine conversation. Since that time, the Ohio State parents have taken the lead, and as we speak, they're doing a protest in Chicago. Since that time, Justin Fields has started an online petition to play football this fall. Since that time, Ohio State's athletic director has put out a simultaneous statement to the same letter that Big Ten Commissioner Kevin Warren put out, sort of underlining what Ohio State's position is in going forward as it relates to fall sports. The mantle was started with Nebraska, right? They had the torch, but it's been taken up by Ohio State football. Now, they've had some allies in that. The Husker parents have talked. But there's been a lot that has happened in the last week that really had nothing to do with Nebraska and had a lot to do with Ohio State. You had these ludicrous rumors coming out of Ohio State country that there was going to be this 6-team revolt breakaway league that was going to start, and there was going to be fall football, and Kevin Warren was going to get sued, which he might, and all of these other things that were going to happen or that were promised to happen, and all of those sources were coming out of Columbus, Ohio, or in Ohio. And so there's something really notable about what's going on here, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I want to start first, Evan, with you and sort of your, thoughts over the last five days or so, and kind of what you've talked to the Husker parents about, where they're going, where they've been, and kind of what you've seen happen over that period of time.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's been a wild week where it's gone from last week where Nebraska was kind of on its own, in terms of trying to get the fall season going. And then it definitely gained some momentum within the league since that time. It kind of felt like this cascading effect where, earlier in the week, it was some of the Nebraska leadership that finally started coming around and maybe being more definitive about the fact that they're not looking at fall sports anymore. Ronnie Green speaking on KLIN and Lincoln about that. Bill Moose talking with you, finally bringing some finality to it, or so we think. But even then, Nebraska parents are continuing kind of their quest, as much of a Hail Mary as it may be at this point, for fall football, or at the very least for greater clarity on the decision-making process that led to its postponement. I think that's kind of the last gasp effort of any kind of football in 2020. I talked with Glenn Snodgrass, who's the father of Garrett Snodgrass, and he's also the high school football coach at York. He's kind of been one of the ringleaders of this parent group, which is now up to about 15 or 16 people. The McCaffreys are part of it. Wandale Robinson's father, Dale, is part of it, and many others. And so they, in talking with Glenn Snodgrass, he kind of said, look, they understand that at this point, the odds are long in playing football this year. They released a letter on Thursday that was similar to one that they released over the weekend. But the big difference this time was it was composed by Mike Flood, the lawyer and former state senator, who is representing this group right now. And they're delivering that to the Big Ten now. And again, their idea, even if they aren't able to play football, they have laid down essentially an ultimatum to Kevin Warren and the Big Ten, saying we demand all documents, recordings, records as it relates to the vote that occurred to postpone fall sports, who voted which way, as well as the medical data and studies that Warren and the presidents based their decision off of. So they have said if they don't receive those on Monday by noon, they'll essentially take legal action. And so that's something that's kind of in the early stages of going on. And he also acknowledged, look, time is not on their side here, right? We're talking about a month or so until college football begins in earnest. They understand that any gasp that they have of their kids playing this fall is running out. And he also made, I think, some pretty good points just about the psychological effects of not only what they've already gone through in terms of, hey, you're not playing football this fall, despite what you worked for all summer and all off season, but kind of that second wave that he's anticipating, which is when these other Power 5 schools, when the other half of the FBS subdivision starts playing, he's worried about what that toll is going to be like every Saturday, seeing the Big 12, seeing the SEC playing football, and those guys being at home. So, like you said, the door is closed on fall football, but kind of the fallout of that decision still kind of lingers on for the time being.
It does. I think there's a chance that the ACC, Big 12, and SEC are not able to play their football seasons. Some of that depends on how much COVID-19 transmission there is on their campuses. I don't know if transmission rates in the community or in the nation at large are that big of a deal, because they don't seem to be that big of a deal to SEC programs at the moment, because the transmission down there is higher than it is up here. But we'll have to see how the campus situation sort of reconciles itself. I know a couple of campuses have already kind of went remote or online. So there's still a chance that football is not played. I think you're going to see the media attention and, quite frankly, the heat turned up on this issue, especially on those three leagues. A lot of the attention that was paid to the Big Ten in the last week and its dysfunction will shift to some of those leagues, and I think you're going to see more and more calls for those schools to not play, or moral critiques. The media's, we're good at that. Sort of a moral criticism, sort of a plague on the house, so to speak. The Mercutio thing. So moral critiques, I think you'll see those get stepped up. I think you're going to see more arguments about, well, if you're going to do this, then they're pro athletes and you have to pay them and they'll be held to pay come next year when, these athletes go on strike, or you have to pay them, or they need a salary, or this is all about money. And if that's all it's about, then, be prepared for lawsuits, all of these different things. I think you're going to see a considerable amount of pressure on the rhetorical front turned up. And, that kind of rhetorical pressure has one thing on players and coaches and athletic directors, and it probably has a little bit different effect on, college presidents who may feel a little bit differently about that particular issue just based on their experience. The one thing that I think all of those leagues can learn from the Big Ten is kind of what I've learned over the last week or so. And when people talk about having a frustration about Kevin Warren, who wrote a letter on Wednesday sort of saying the decision won't be revisited, and then gave 5 interviews, I don't know what the right word is, accepting responsibility for the way that the issue was communicated, which I think is very fair. One of the things that I've learned over that period of time, and I got this in talking to Bill Moose, is that when Kevin Warren was having these meetings, he did not have a meeting. He did not have consistent dialogue between the athletic directors and the chancellors and presidents, or the athletic directors and the medical officials. So imagine for a minute that you have guys like Gene Smith and Barry Alvarez, a woman like Sandy Barber, somebody like Bill Moose, all of these people in a room, these athletic directors who have been in athletics for hundreds and hundreds of years when you combine their experience, not having a consistent or even present dialogue with the people who are making the decisions about all of these sports. That Kevin Warren operated in a silo with the athletic directors and the coaches, the medical personnel, and the presidents and chancellors, and did not cross-pollinate those discussions at all. When people wonder about why there is confusion, communication confusion, one of the reasons why there is confusion about whether there was a vote is because while Bill Moose and Ronnie Green have a very transparent relationship, I don't think that's necessarily the case at some of these other universities, and it may not be the case by design. In other words, some of these presidents and chancellors may not want to have that sort of transparent communication with their athletic directors based on the nature of the decision. As a result, there was a lot not known about what happened in the presidents and chancellors' meetings if you did not get that information directly from a president or a chancellor. If you didn't get it directly from them or from, one of their spokespeople, you would not know exactly what went into the decision because there was not a dialogue between those folks and the athletic directors. There was not a consistent dialogue. And imagine this in the Zoom era. All you need is a computer and a place where there isn't chaos all over to get a bunch of people on a Zoom call, and that did not happen. It didn't happen. And so as a result, there was the confusion over the last week where there was not that kind of conversation had. And some of these presidents apparently do not have the kind of conversations that Green and Moose have. Because what Penn State's Sandy Barber said earlier this week, or what Minnesota's president said, that is a terrible look. They said, we don't know if there was a vote. We're not even sure. That lends more credence to the idea that the person who was the linchpin in the entire discussion was Kevin Warren. Even if the presidents and the chancellors made the final decision, he was responsible for giving the message of the athletic directors and the medical personnel to those chancellors and presidents. As a result, he bears most of the responsibility for the decision, and he bears most of the responsibility for communicating the decision. And when he was not able to clearly communicate several factors in that Big Ten Network interview, that only set off another round of questions. And I think as a result, that's where the frustration came from. And there's going to be people who defend Kevin Warren. I saw some column today out of the Indianapolis Star from a noted hothead and guy that loves getting angry all the time, saying it wasn't Kevin Warren's fault and get off his back and all this other stuff. But in the reality, if you understand the situation, you know why people are frustrated specifically with him, because he made a choice to have siloed discussions. And we talk a lot about political silos. These were siloed discussions. And he was the linchpin in all of those. He was walking from silo to silo. And as a result, you have this sort of residual frustration over a choice he explicitly made. And I'm not sure why the athletic directors didn't raise hell and say, we need to get in on a meeting. We got to get in on a meeting now. And I don't care if you don't like it. We need to have a meeting with everybody in the room. But that's where some of the frustration and confusion came from. And as a result, you had the last week of just sort of unrelenting frustration poured toward one guy. Because as it got out, it became somewhat clear that Kevin Warren was the one guy that was in the room, in every room where it was happening. And he was then tasked with going out and communicating that decision to everybody else. I can also tell you that a lot of athletic directors did not want to go conference only because they knew it was going to cut off some of these smaller programs, like in the MAC, at the knees. And the Big Ten went conference only a long time ago. And in doing that, they cut off some of these leagues and forced those leagues into a position where they were probably going to have to cancel. The only leagues that are still playing that are smaller, Group of Five, are Conference USA, Sun Belt, and I think the AAC. But the MAC and the Mountain West are out because they got cut off at the knees by the Pac-12 and the Big Ten going conference only. So when you look at the totality of the picture, you understand why there's a great deal of frustration centered on where the Big Ten's decision-making has been at since early July and why it will be different going forward. The key thing that came out of Wednesday's letter from Kevin Warren was this: that there's going to be a return to competition task force that cross-pollinates everybody. So there's athletic directors, there's chancellors and presidents, there's medical personnel, there's senior women faculty representatives, and there's going to be coaches. And they're all going to be in the same room. And when all of those people are in the same room, the dynamic changes quickly. It shifts very quickly. It shifts away from a very, very sort of specific and tailored conversation, whether it's with the athletic directors and the coaches saying, we've got to do this, the medical personnel saying, we shouldn't do this too. Now you start having a public discussion that balances and weighs the arguments. And it takes the athletic director and coach position and weighs it against the medical personnel decision. And that's how decision-making is done. And I already know, because you and I cover this a lot, I already know which way the news media thinks it should go, but they're not the ones making that decision. And when you get a bunch of people in a room and you say, all right, we're going to make a public health policy decision that takes into account both the mental health of an athlete not playing and the physical health of that athlete as it relates to coronavirus, you tend to have very different kinds of decisions than you might if you just had siloed conversations. Nothing hurts worse in some ways than a slight. And when you're left out of something that you think you should be brought into, and you're left out of that, the amount of frustration that goes into that moment is very high. And I think there are a lot of Big Ten athletic directors who have mountains and mountains of experience. Gene Smith, for example. being left out of a conversation, and a decision is being left up to, for example, Christina Johnson at Ohio State, who just took the job. She just took the job. She hasn't even been at Ohio State for very long. And a massive decision about a major college football program is left in the hands of a person who just got there, and that person isn't in a meeting with the Ohio State athletic director. That's a problem. Now, Christina Johnson, I think, ended up voting for playing football, or whatever you want to call it, expressed a desire to do that. But that's how it looks. It looks weird when you have a brand new president who's never in a meeting with her athletic director who's got 50 years of experience. And I think that's where the frustration for Kevin Warren comes from. And the way that it's going to change going forward is the return to task force competition group, that return to competition task force is going to have a cross-pollination group. It's going to be a bunch of different people there. And beyond that, Ohio State has made very clear in the last 5 days, we're playing a season. If the ACC, the Big 12, and the SEC play a season, Ohio State's playing a football season. I think they've made that abundantly clear.
Yeah, no doubt. And what's interesting, too, is you can directly compare and contrast kind of in an apples-to-apples comparison with the Pac-12. And how often do we say the Pac-12 got it right? But, you look at how they laid out all of their medical findings. Their commissioner, Larry Scott, was much more forthcoming with what he put out there. And so what have we heard about the Pac-12 in the last 10 days? Almost nothing. Like that decision was set and people moved on. And so I think the way you lay it out, you can kind of start to see why, there's been talk about how the Big Ten never really fully considered spring as an option until like a week ago, and how amazing that was to people. And it's like, wow, they had 5 months. But when you lay it out as you do, you can just see how slowly everything moves. Not all ideas are being thrown out there. And so it's been a rough thing. And then, like you said, 8 days for Kevin Warren before he comes out with a statement. I mean, that's what you need to do the day that you announce it, so people can process it, digest it, and you can start to move on. And so this thing festered for more than a week. It costs, tons of prep time for what the Big Ten is hoping to do in the winter, in the spring, whatever you want to call it. And yeah, absolutely. I think you mix all that, and then you throw in some other extenuating circumstances, like the fact that Kevin Warren's son is still practicing and preparing to play at Mississippi State. I mean, that I know that is a major rub for Big Ten parents as they're trying to get some clarity, and they can see that. I mean, that has not helped his case either. And so kind of he's fighting this war on a lot of different fronts. And it doesn't, I think Iowa parents said it too, it doesn't give you a lot of faith in this decision, but also in any other decision the league makes going forward, with the exception of hopefully that return to competition task force, maybe bringing some clarity to things.
And I go back and forth on whether or not the reason the Big Ten did not have a better explanation on that day last Tuesday was because they essentially let Kevin Warren be responsible for the decision, like the explanation of it, and they figured he'd go out and do a good job, and then he didn't do a very good job, and then it started looking worse and worse and worse. Or if somehow they just kind of figured any explanation would work and the media would take care of it and take over and kind of handle the explanation for us, and then the other leagues might cancel, and then we could just kind of go along with our way. I'm not really sure. What I can say is that I read the Pac-12's medical document. Now it's 12 pages. Just waving around a document and saying, here's your document, that doesn't do anything for me as a critical thinker. It may do something for national sports media that goes, well, here's the reason. But the reasons that the Pac-12 lists out over 12 pages are not any real different than the things that Warren listed out on his explanation on Wednesday. I mean, it's transmission rates. It's a concern over myocarditis. It's concern over contact tracing, number of tests, test availability. It's many of the same things. It's just laid out over 12 pages. I don't know how many people actually read the 12 pages, but you can take the 12 pages And the ACC, the Big 12, and the SEC have a refutation to the 12 pages. Like it's not what I would say, I guess, is that it's not a guaranteed, it's not a guaranteed explanation of anything, except for people who want it to have a tidy explanation so they can move on to the other leagues and pinpoint their mistakes too. Does that make sense?
It does, but don't you think this has been interesting too? I mean, I saw some of the Pac-12 coaches were having interviews even this week. I think Stanford was doing one about how its players were expressing gratitude at the Pac-12 for doing the right thing, or Tanner Morgan, the quarterback at Minnesota, saying, yeah, he would prefer to play football, but this was the right move, and then contrast that with, what you see with players at Nebraska or Ohio State or wherever it might be. And I just think that strikes me as just fascinating, where I think it has to come from the coaches, the administrators that are kind of filtering it down to those players. But you absolutely are seeing it play out sometimes on a team-to-team basis where players en masse accept the decision or they don't accept the decision. It's really fascinating to watch.
Yeah, it's a case-by-case basis, and I think, athletes are humans too. Of course they are. But like all of us, I think, during the course of the pandemic have went through these moments of, and maybe you haven't, but I have, of like, I'm just going to go live my life, man. I can't sit in my house all day. And then there's these other moments where it sort of vacillates between I'm just going to live my life and God dang, I don't want to get this. I'm just going to stay at home today, tomorrow, next week, forever. I think it's human to have those vacillating emotions. And so I think you could probably drill down into any player and say, are you sure you never had to worry about it? And they would probably end up saying, a lot of players would say, yeah, I mean, you think about it. And then simultaneously, if you went to a Tanner Morgan and said, so you're telling me that you haven't thought about playing? You really agree with it? And I think, you'd probably hear something closer to, well, yeah, I wish I was playing. So I'm sure it's more of a range, but at the same time, the Pac-12, some of the stuff going on in the Pac-12 is a little different than the Big Ten, and the dynamics are just a little different. So, and one of the dynamics is I don't know that there's any school in the Pac-12 that even had any latitude to play. And Moose is informed there because A, he used to be a Pac-12 athletic director, and B, his son plays for Cal, right? Well, his son, he's like, my son is in a studio apartment by himself, and there's virtually no latitude to even do voluntary workouts. There's no room, there's no whatever to even do that yet. So that in and of itself is a very different environment than what's going on here. I mean, Nebraska football players aren't, sitting in their house wondering if they can even go outside. And I think, so what's going on in the state of California is very different than what's going on here. I think that's one of the issues, is that how many 4 of the teams in the league are locked in that situation.
Right.
Cases are skyrocketing in Arizona. Oregon has a very unique political situation. Oregon has actually not been hit that hard by the virus, or at least not numbers of cases and whatever, and yet they're taking a very cautious stance. Some of that may be rooted in availability of tests. We're not really sure. But I was talking to Mike Riley last week, and his daughter lives in Oregon, still in Corvallis. His grandson is not going to school for like 9 weeks. It's all remote. And their rates are lower than, they're like per 100,000 rates are lower than here. So there's some political environment there that's going to make everything really hard to even accomplish as a Cushman truck goes by here. So it's a unique experience they've got in the Pac-12, but I do think the Big Ten going forward is going to have a different vantage point in terms of getting back to competition, to the point where even if the conditions were very similar to the way they are right now, I think there's a possibility that the takeaway is different, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I keep thinking about what this winter season could look like, and I feel like we can't really make the full judgment on what that would even be until we see what happens this fall with everybody else.
Yeah.
Right? Like if the Big 12 and the SEC and the ACC are able to play out a full season and their college football playoff, ends roughly the same time that the Big 10 is starting up, I mean that's worst case scenario for the Big 10, which essentially is is coming in and playing a league season with no real national implications, possibly already without many of its premier players. I mean, that's a bad look. Conversely, if things in those other leagues have to shut down in early October, and then the Big Ten swoops in and saves the day, maybe with some better information in January or February, maybe it turns out differently. But like, I think these next couple months are really fascinating because you get the sense that, the SEC and the Big 12 and those guys more than ever want to show that they can do this thing and say, look at those guys over there sitting it out. While meanwhile the Big 10 and the Pac-12, don't they have to on some level be thinking, come on, shut this thing down or we're going to look terrible? Like there's just so many, I guess, kind of side things going on just around this idea of playing football. It's really fascinating.
I could see it going both ways. If those schools fall apart and they're not able to get their season in, then you can plausibly go back to your athletes and say, look, you know what? Yeah, we canceled early, but it fell apart for them. We move on, so on and so forth. On the flip side of the coin, if they're able to pull off their season successfully, you can say to your athletes, well, you get to play season 2, and you just have to play it in January. That won't be ideal, but we're going to do it, and you get to play a season of football. The trouble that comes with that, of course, is some of what Moose described is a concern that, it's going to be considered, as not as important as the main college football season. And as a result, it's going to seem less exciting and enticing to fans. But he's like, players want to play, coaches want to coach, and fans want to watch. So, yeah, they're going to do it. I still think that the early January plan is probably the better of the two plans. I know there's another plan that they may start in mid-February, play games. That's sort of the Jeff Brom plan. And that way you can play games outdoors and you can play the games at home. I still think you're going to see the January plan push because I think that's what Ohio State wants. And I think Ohio State wants to retain most of its football players. Because if Ohio State has to start in mid-February, those kids are probably going to just go to the NFL. And I don't think Ohio State wants to do that. And I think Ohio State, their voice, especially in desiring to play football, looms very large in this discussion. And I'm not exactly sure when it happened, but Ohio State has changed from Sweater Vest U to a program that really isn't paying that much attention to the Big Ten. It only pays attention to the Big Ten in relation to that as its official conference peer. But I think Ohio State looks as much south at Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, and LSU as they do at this point north at Michigan. When you've beaten a team as many times in a row, I think 8, that Ohio State has beaten Michigan, how badly are you examining what Michigan's doing on a daily basis? Like, Ohio State certainly wants to beat Michigan and did beat Michigan, and they pour a lot of energy into beating Michigan. But I don't know that their vantage point is solely on Michigan now. I think they look at their rivals in the South and they say our rivals are the best teams in the country, and those teams are going to get to play, and we're not.
Right.
And I think that informs the way they look at the world.
The other thing I'd add about these next few months is, at what point does the value of trying to preserve the 2021 season really come into play, right? Like, Jeff Brom's plan essentially called for that 2021 season to start a month later than it typically would, in early October. Ohio State's plan is probably better in that sense, in that you can finish the season in March probably, and then hopefully come into some semblance of a normal 2021. But like, I'll be fascinated to see if it comes down to it, how schools treat the spring and trying to clear up eligibility issues and maybe get some home games, how they balance all that against, again, returning to normal, quote unquote, in 2021. Because I feel like that's awfully important. You don't want to go to a conference schedule in 2021. You don't want to start later and start, affecting multiple seasons. So to me, it comes down to like, if you have to scrap spring entirely and miss a full season in the name of saving 2021, do you do that? Or do you affect it knowing that you can maybe recoup some things and square up some eligibility issues in the spring? I think that'll be something really to watch in the next few months too.
I think that's a great point. The NCAA Board of Governors is going to vote today on an eligibility process. And essentially, I think what they're going to vote for is the ability to just get a free year of eligibility whether you play or not. And so seniors who are seniors this year would be able to play this year and then play again next year. And you'd have scholarships added on to the back end, right? And so you'd have a ballooned scholarship limit. How much higher that limit goes, I'm not sure. Maybe they'll determine that today. I would think 25, because that's what you get every year. So it could, in theory, go up to 110 for a year or two. So we'll see if that's kind of how that goes. It could be 100. It could be 125, 110. I guess we'll find out. The NCAA will make that decision. And I think then you'll see some schools kind of figure out, all right, how many guys do we have that actually want to come back in 2021 if we don't play a season in winter or in fall? B, how much can we afford? Because I don't think every athletic department can afford the same amount of scholarships. It's not cheap. I mean, it's a very expensive undertaking. C, then you got to start thinking about, all right, how big do we want a roster to get? How many guys do we want to keep around? How many guys are going to leave? Because, you know what? If we're going to play 2 more seasons and I can't even get on the field until 2022, maybe I need to go somewhere else. I don't know that that's really the case at Nebraska, but it could be the case at some other places, and so on and so on. I could envision a Brendan Hymas, for example, saying, look, if we play in winter 2021, we play in January, I'm on board, but he may be ready to go to the NFL next spring and not want to come back for the 2021 season for what would amount to his 5th year, a redshirt year. Simultaneously, I can see some guys saying, I don't know what my NFL stock is, and if you want to keep me aboard, and I'm a guy that can start for you for 2 years, and I get a chance to progress toward my master's and all those classes are paid for, I'll stay.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting to look back at the spring too and see, like Wisconsin, for example, in the spring, they don't have baseball, but Barry Alvarez, their AD, essentially said, thanks, but that's it. Like they did not entertain the idea of bringing back their spring sport athletes. Those players have all moved on with no real choice of their own. So it'll be fascinating to me what a school like that does in the fall with football, if that's a different conversation. But yeah, I mean, as it pertains to Nebraska, you look at their senior group. I mean, I can just run them off quick. It's a pretty small group, and you think probably most of these guys, you mentioned Hymas, but a lot of these guys will probably be back. Dedrick Mills, Jack Stoll, Barniak, Bo Wilson, Christian Gaylord, Ben Stilley, JoJo Doman, Colin Miller, Will Honus, Boodle, Deontay Williams, Markel Dismuke. I mean, most of those players are starters. Most of those players are guys you figure would want to play up their stock as opposed to being guys who are, set in where they are. So, yeah, I mean, you look in that scenario for Nebraska specifically, you would imagine they'd be, 100, 101 scholarships next year if it played out that way. In my opinion, it seems like most of those guys, their prudent decision would be to come back.
Yeah, I think Hymas is a guy. I think Dedrick Mills is ready to go to the NFL after whatever happens. I think he's logged enough carries on his legs, and he's got enough film accumulated from 3 different schools that I would say Mills, and I think Mills can play in the NFL. I really do.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm wrong, but I could see him going. And you just never know. And then there's some situations which, you don't want to speculate, but this will happen at some school, maybe not Nebraska, where it's like, you got your degree, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm.
Good luck. I actually don't know if that would be the case in Nebraska. I think all their seniors pretty much contribute, but you could see a situation where they're like, look, you've graduated, congratulations on that, and you have not played much for the first 4 years. We kept you on scholarship because that's what we believe in. But now that you have your degree, take care, have fun.
Oh yeah, we saw that a lot in spring sports. Nebraska baseball did that with a couple of guys, essentially, where it was like, it might be time to move on to that next step. I mean, but you're right. There's really not a lot of that with Nebraska specifically. So you got to think if blanket eligibility were allowed to extend, that Nebraska would probably have one of the bigger rosters in 2021 in terms of scholarship. Again, probably over 100. I know they don't have a huge senior class, but if most of those guys come back, it could be really interesting.
Yeah, the scholarship limit piece will be interesting because if you can get to 110 and you only have so many seniors, then that means you could put a few walk-ons on scholarship,
Yeah.
or sign a bigger class than you thought you would, I guess. I mean, if that makes sense. Nebraska has tried to max out its 25 every year. So there's that. But just based on the scholarship numbers they had this year, if they'd played the season as planned, I don't know if they could have gotten to 25 without hitting the 85 limit. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe they would have. Maybe they will, with some guys leaving the program. But eventually, I think you'll see Nebraska get to a point where maybe they can't take 25 because they already have plenty of guys in the program, and they've built their pipeline. Their roster size is 156. And technically, I guess it'd be 157 if Oliver Martin is playing this fall, next spring, whatever. So it's a huge roster, and just huge. And that's where they want it. They want it to be big because that's their vision. And I think it's the biggest in the Big Ten, but I have to look through the rosters and find out.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, we talked about that plenty, of how they can maximize reps and that sort of thing.
Right. Splitting them up into groups. Looks like they're going to do a 12-week or a 12-hour-a-week plan, right? So there's sort of that's pretty low level commitment. So that's starting Monday.
Yeah, starting Monday, 12-hour a week limit. 5 of those can go toward on-field skill instruction, helmets only. No, you can't go full pads, and then the rest of it's team meetings, film study, strength and conditioning, that sort of thing. It's a little bit more than what they would get in a standard off season, but I was thinking, Sam, the other day about Frost's quote when he was lobbying for a fall season about how when you shut something down, how hard it is to restart the longer that you go. And he was talking about businesses, but he was also talking about football. And I was thinking, man, if the Big Ten and Nebraska doesn't play a spring season, they'll have gone from Black Friday 2019 to potentially the spring or the fall of 2021 without being in full pads. They got 2 unpadded spring practices. I mean, that's amazing. That's an unheard of amount of time for college players not to be in full pads. I mean, think about how hard that is to keep your edge, to get restarted, to get back into a rhythm. It's been 3 straight years for Nebraska without a bowl. You don't get those practices. It's been wild. I mean, just in terms of the guys that haven't been able to get out there and get reps and improve the play. Can you imagine
the next game on Nebraska's schedule being in Ireland.
Right.
I don't think I feel like that's not going to happen. Don't. With where things are at in our world today, I just have a hard time believing that there's going to be a football game played overseas. Even if I think Ireland's probably doing okay with the coronavirus, but still, like it seems a little dicey, like see you in 2021 in Ireland,
Right. Not bloody likely, right? Doesn't seem.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So we'll see what the weekend brings, but I think that the door's been closed on the Big Ten. I want you to talk a little bit about baseball if you can. You've written a couple of stories about the work they did in Summer League and also the roster makeover. It's pretty significant, right?
Yeah, it was good. I was able to catch up with Will Bolt, the coach, for probably half an hour earlier this week about a couple different things. And I think, it turned into kind of two pieces. One, looking back at the summer, and that's always fascinating for a number of reasons that I can get into here shortly, but then looking forward also at the fall. And they are confident that they'll have some kind of a workout this fall. I know the Nebraska Twitter put out the baseball Twitter about their first team meeting this week, and they were all spread out, social distanced at Haymarket Park in the stands there. And they expect to get going as usual in September. I mean, not as usual in every sense, but they're expecting to be out there for workouts and to try to get a better sense about who's where for 2021. But yeah, you look back at the summer, and I thought it was especially fascinating this year. I mean, I did a piece on Chase Shaneman earlier in the summer as a guy who opened the year as Nebraska's closer this last spring, and he was just tearing it up as a starter. He had an ERA of barely over 1 in the Expedition League, and Will Bolt said, "Yeah, I mean, that's a guy who made his statement. That's someone who will strongly look at to move into the starting rotation this next season." Colby Gomez was kind of the opposite. I mean, he was a guy who was a great closer for Nebraska 2 years ago. Last year, they experimented with him as a starter, and not to say that he won't be a starter still, but it's really indicative when you look at what guys do in the summer, because Nebraska coaches and any college coaches have a strong say in what role their players are playing in the summer leagues. And so it was notable that Gomez was entirely a reliever, and he was a good one for his summer team down in Texas. And so that's a guy that at this moment I would look at to move back and to be a good bullpen piece, especially because they added a lot of talented guys. New Mexico State's ace from last year, Chance Roach, comes to Nebraska. He's probably going to be a weekend guy too. Spencer Schwellenbach, the shortstop, he was someone who was drafted out of high school. He was off to a pretty good start for his sophomore year this past spring, but he hit like 350, showed speed, showed power. That's somebody who coaches really expect to blow up. And then a couple newcomers that put themselves on notice here this summer were, I think it's Efrain. I think that's how you pronounce it. Cervantes, who was a JUCO transfer from Arizona. He hit in the neighborhood of 350 in the Expedition League this summer also, somebody to watch. And Logan Foster is somebody, he's was with the team last year, but he was transferring, and he's someone who had an on-base percentage of over 400. So he'll be a factor in the outfield too. So those are some summer notes. And then, you look at just the roster turnover for this year. It's kind of interesting because it's kind of we talk about what football situation is. This is kind of that, except a few months down the line, because they started working on this in March and April. And so, they they lost 11 players on the team for a variety of reasons. A lot of young guys transferred to the junior college ranks. Aaron Polensky, who was their best hitter the last couple of years, was an undrafted free agent with the Yankees. A couple guys medically retired, but I think, you look at it, you kind of zoom out in big picture and you say, really, outside of Gareth Stroh, who was Nebraska's Friday guy this year and transferred to Wichita State, most of those guys were not major contributors last year. They weren't expected to be contributors imminently. And then the guys that they added, I think it's 7 junior college transfers, a lot of whom are pretty talented guys and accomplished players at their respective levels, come in and add depth right away. So you see a roster that typically has to be at 35 with NCAA limits. It's at 43 right now, and it can be all season because of the relief the NCAA granted. A lot of teams are going to be closer to 50 because Nebraska only brought back 3 seniors that decided to keep their eligibility. Luke Roscom, Joe Acker, and Mojo Hagee. Everybody else moved on in some fashion. So Nebraska's roster is bigger, but it's not as big probably as most college baseball teams at this point. And so you're going to see this theme in college baseball across the board. Everyone's going to be deeper. I think those midweek games are going to be a lot more palatable than usual because there are actually going to be some talented pitchers or more established pitchers throwing in those games. But I know that Will Bolt and that staff, they got on it in terms of recruiting. They had a vision for what they wanted their roster to be. And I think that extra offseason, as much of a drag as it was, really benefited them in getting it where they wanted it to be quicker than it would have been in a typical situation.
That's a good point. It looks like a really interesting team. Maybe one that has to win with pitching and defense a little more than hitting. Because I think Polinsky is a tough bat to replace. I think he's going to be a really good player. I really do. On a major league roster, everyday starter. He's a different player than Nicky Lopez is for the Royals. Hear me, okay? He's not the same kind of player. But I think his rise is similar to Lopez in the sense that, I don't think anybody thought Nicky was going to be, a major league starter. But he kept getting better and better and better and better. And I think Polinsky's going to be the same way. I think he's going to surprise some people pretty quickly. So I think he was on his way to a huge year. And, maybe an All-American year we would have seen. But unfortunately, it didn't come to pass. The coronavirus canceled that. From a budgetary standpoint, Nebraska baseball safe as is every other sport, according to Bill Moose. Whatever they do with budget issues is not going to be addressed through cutting sports. I do think, obviously, there's going to be some hard decisions to make as it relates to the department itself. But they're going to keep the sports alive. No cutting of sports, Moose said, at least through this year. And remember, if they do cut sports, the likelihood of that being a men's sport is very high because of Title IX compliance. So you cut a women's sport, you probably have to cut 2 men because there's a proportionality limit that you want to have to reach. And especially with the size of Nebraska's football team, you can't go cutting women's sports without men's sports not being cut too. So that's an educated guess, but it's a good one. It would be difficult to remove a women's sport without removing multiple men's sports. So you want no sports to be removed, but if there ever was just one, it would probably be on the men's side. Nebraska has not cut a sport since, do you remember, Evan?
Oh, boy. Did they have men's soccer?
They had men's swimming.
Men's swimming, that's right. Yep.
They cut it after sort of an NCAA investigation. Bill Byrne went in and just ended the program, kept the women's program going, ended the men's program. Nebraska swimming and diving has never really been the same since that. And I think that was 20 years ago. I think we're right around the 20-year anniversary of that, actually. Maybe it was 2001, but I think it was 2000. Yeah, I think all that stuff went down in 2000, if I'm not mistaken. Or around 2000/2001, somewhere in there. It all kind of went down there. So, pretty interesting, huh?
Something, man. We should be talking about position battles and practice reports and took a different spin.
Yeah, it did. It did. It's going to be tough to – the next couple of weeks will be unique and interesting. Those won't be easy, especially when the season starts. I'm going to be watching I need to be watching. I'm an AP voter, but, it'll be weird. Weird to pull up a Saturday slate of games and not have a single Big Ten game. Wonder what those kids are doing, what they're thinking, what's going through their minds. You just pray for them because it's hard, right? Everything that's going on in the coronavirus pandemic, the people making the decisions are not 18 to 22 years old. They're just not. They make their own personal decisions as to how safe they are with the virus out there, but they're not making the policy decisions. And so many people from college age all the way down to preschool have had their lives considerably affected by decisions that adults do or don't make. And so that's always tough when you don't have a full say in your own well-being. And that's kind of what's happened so far.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It's going to be weird. I mean, I think we'll probably see some more high school games as they go.
Yeah.
It's going to be an odd fall.
It will. There's going to be basketball. I'm confident of it. The NCAA will make sure of it. The NCAA will do whatever it needs to do to get it done. I think the NCAA is going to turn a leaf here, and you're going to see them come up with a plan that works for them. They sat out football. They kind of sat out football, and I think you're going to see them ramp it up for hoops. Guess we'll find out. All right, that's everything we have this week for the Pick Six Podcast. Thank you for listening and joining in. For Evan Bland, I'm Sam McKewon. We'll be back next week to talk about who knows what. We're in uncharted waters, right?
Yeah.
Take care.